I am Melody, 32 years old and a corporate auditor who always played by the rules. My husband left me stranded at the airport in a blizzard and drove off to a luxury vacation. 13 days later, when I never came home, he asked the housekeeper where I had been, and her answer brought him to his knees. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been abandoned by the person who promised to protect you. Growing up, I believed marriage was a partnership built on mutual respect. I applied that same diligent logic to my career, working long hours to become a respected corporate auditor in Chicago. Numbers made sense to me because they always balanced, unlike human beings. I met Derek 5 years ago. He was 35, a high-flying investment manager with an infectious smile and a wardrobe that cost more than my first car. But once the wedding ring was on my finger, the charming facade began to crack, revealing a man utterly consumed by his own reflection and his family's insatiable vanity. Derek treated his family like royalty, especially his older sister Chelsea. Chelsea was the undisputed golden child, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, but somehow felt entitled to the world. Her husband, Jamal, an African-American man with a booming laugh and flashy watches, fit right into their dynamic. Jamal bragged about his consulting startup at every dinner, often belittling my traditional career. He would swirl his expensive wine and mock my long hours, while Chelsea would chime in wondering why I bothered working so hard when Derek made such good money. I usually bit my tongue to keep the peace. The cracks in our marriage turned into a gaping chasm this past winter. Derek had planned a lavish ski trip to Aspen for the four of us. It was meant to be a celebration of his recent promotion, a week of five-star dining and exclusive slopes. I had been dreading it for weeks. But 2 days before our departure, I started feeling unwell. A deep rattling cough settled in my chest, accompanied by a relentless chill that no amount of blankets could cure. By the morning of our flight, I was burning with a 102-degree fever. Every joint ached, and taking a full breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. I begged Derek to let me stay home. I told him I was too sick to travel, that I just needed rest. Instead of showing concern, his face contorted with irritation. He paced around our bedroom, adjusting his designer ski jacket, furious that my illness was ruining his perfect schedule. He told me I was being dramatic, that I just needed some cold medicine, and that Chelsea and Jamal were already waiting in the SUV. He refused to look like a fool showing up to Aspen without his wife. So, pushing through the agonizing pain and blinding dizziness, I dragged myself into the freezing Chicago morning. The blizzard hit us the moment we reached the highway. The wind howled against the car windows, and snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. By the time we arrived at O'Hare Airport, the terminals were a chaotic nightmare of stranded travelers and delayed flights. My fever had spiked even higher during the stressful drive. My vision blurred at the edges, and I could barely keep my legs from buckling under my own weight. We stood near the crowded check-in counter, the harsh fluorescent lights amplifying my pounding headache. Chelsea stood a few feet away, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernails against her phone case, loudly complaining that my slow pace was going to make them miss their priority boarding. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head and making a snide comment about how some people just could not handle a little winter weather. I leaned against a concrete pillar, struggling to pull air into my burning lungs. I looked at Derek, tears of physical agony welling in my eyes, and told him I could not get on that plane. I told him I needed to go to a hospital. Derek did not offer me his arm. He did not ask if I was okay. Instead, his eyes narrowed with a cold, narcissistic rage that completely stripped away the man I thought I married. He looked at me not as a sick wife needing help, but as a defective accessory ruining his aesthetic. Without a word of sympathy, he reached out and violently yanked my large suitcase away from my trembling grip. I tried to stop him. I weakly reached for the handle, crying out that my prescription medication and my identification wallet were tucked inside the front pocket of that bag. But my fever-ravaged body was no match for his anger. He shoved my hand away with brutal indifference. The force of his rejection sent me stumbling backward against the cold concrete pillar. "Call an Uber so you do not ruin our vacation," he spat with pure disgust. You are always finding ways to play the victim. Figure it out yourself. With those final venomous words, Derek turned his back on me. He grabbed the handle of my suitcase merged with Chelsea and Jamal and briskly walked toward the security checkpoint. They did not look back. Not a single one of them turned around to see if I was okay. I watched their designer winter coats disappear into the sea of frustrated travelers taking my medication, my identification, and the last shred of my marriage with them. My heart ached at the stark realization. I truly believed he loved me. It hurt so much. The howling wind rattled the glass doors of the terminal as a fresh wave of dizziness washed over me. The cacophony of the airport faded into a dull roar. My knees finally gave out and I sank toward the freezing floor, abandoned and severely ill, entirely alone in the middle of a winter storm. The screen of my phone blurred as my shaking hands struggled to keep it steady. Absolute zero. I refreshed the banking application 3 times, convinced that the hospital's weak internet connection was simply failing to load the data correctly. But the bold black numbers remained stubbornly unchanged. The emergency fund, a safety net I had painstakingly built over 5 years of grueling corporate audits, was entirely gone. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck, completely overriding the intense heat of my pneumonia fever. The social worker, a kind woman named Brenda, returned to my bedside with a mobile payment terminal in her hands. She offered a sympathetic smile, explaining that the admissions department required a standard hold for uninsured emergency care. I numbly handed over my primary credit card, a platinum card I paid off in full every single month. Brenda inserted the chip. The machine beeped a harsh, unforgiving tone. Declined. She tried a second time, her smile faltering slightly, as the same obnoxious error message flashed across the small screen. Panic, sharp and suffocating, clawed its way up my raw throat. I asked her to try my backup card, digging into the hidden pocket of my phone case where I kept an emergency visa. Declined. My entire financial existence had been systematically obliterated. Brenda gently set the payment terminal on the rolling tray table. Her expression shifted from standard administrative courtesy to deep, genuine concern. She asked if there was a mistake, perhaps a fraud alert triggered by the hospital location. But deep down, I already knew this was not a bank error. My husband had executed a flawless financial strike. The mobile application on my phone only displayed the current available balances, masking the detailed routing information I desperately needed to see. I looked at Brenda, my voice cracking as I begged her for a massive favor. I told her I was a corporate auditor, that I needed to access a full desktop browser to pull the comprehensive transaction ledgers immediately. Seeing the sheer desperation in my feverish eyes, she nodded slowly. She helped me unhook the mobile oxygen monitor from my finger and supported my weight as I dragged my weak, aching body out of the narrow hospital bed. My bare feet hit the freezing linoleum floor, sending shudders up my spine. We slowly walked down the brightly lit corridor to a quiet, secluded alcove just behind the main nurses' station. Brenda logged into a secure administrative computer and stepped back, granting me temporary access to the keyboard. I sank into the vinyl office chair, pulling my thin hospital gown tightly around my trembling shoulders. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys with practiced precision. I bypassed the mobile authentication hurdles and accessed the primary web portal for our joint financial accounts. The full ledger loaded onto the bright monitor, revealing a devastating, undeniable truth. Just 3 hours before our scheduled flight to Aspen, while I was agonizing in bed with a 102-degree fever, Derek had initiated a series of maximum limit wire transfers. He had completely emptied the high-yield savings account. He had drained our joint checking account down to a negative balance. He had even maxed out the cash advance limits on every single credit card attached to my name. This was not a spontaneous act of anger from a husband annoyed by a ruined vacation. This was a highly calculated, meticulously executed financial assassination. I knew exactly what he was doing when he ripped my suitcase out of my hands at the airport terminal. He knew he was taking my physical identification, my medication, and my only means of survival, while simultaneously ensuring I had zero digital resources to fall back on. He had deliberately stripped me of everything, leaving me utterly destitute in the middle of a massive winter storm. The sheer cruelty of his actions slammed into me with the force of a freight train. I stared at the glowing screen, my chest heaving as the monitor illuminated the names attached to the outgoing wire transfers. The funds had not simply been moved to a different personal account. They had been funneled directly into a complex web of external holding accounts, purposely structured to obscure the final destination. I sat there in the quiet hum of the hospital corridor, the reality of my marriage crumbling into dust before my eyes. For 5 years, I had believed I was building a life with a partner. I had paid the majority of our living expenses, trusting his repeated claims that his investment income was tied up in long-term portfolios for our future. Instead, I had been blindly funding my own destruction. The man who had promised to love and protect me had intentionally weaponized my vulnerability. He had left me to die on the airport floor, fully aware that if I somehow survived, I would wake up to absolute financial ruin. A profound, hollow silence settled over my mind, drowning out the ambient noise of the emergency room. The overwhelming urge to break down and cry vanished, replaced entirely by an icy, absolute clarity. The fever ravaging my body felt secondary to the burning realization igniting in my brain. Derek assumed I would collapse under the immense weight of this betrayal. He assumed I would remain the quiet, compliant wife who always prioritized his family over my own well-being. I thought he had successfully cornered a helpless victim. But he had made one catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. He had forgotten who he married. He had forgotten that tracing hidden money, uncovering buried financial secrets, and dismantling complex corporate frauds was exactly what I did for a living. I logged out of the browser, my hands no longer shaking at all. I looked at Brenda, thanked her very quietly for her immense help, and walked back to my hospital bed without needing her physical support. The brief mourning period for my marriage was officially over. I pulled the thin hospital blanket up to my chin and leaned back against the stiff pillows. The relentless burn of the pneumonia still gripped my chest, but the overwhelming adrenaline flooding my system completely masked the physical pain. I unplugged my phone from the generic charger Brenda had provided. The battery indicator showed a solid 50% enough power to begin dismantling the illusion of my life. As a corporate auditor, I specialized in finding the invisible threads of financial deception that greedy executives tried to bury. Derek thought a wiped account would stop me, but a zero balance is never the end of an audit. It is simply the starting point. I bypassed the mobile banking application entirely, opening a private browser window and forcing the desktop version of the banking portal. My fingers moved swiftly, entering my master credentials and navigating deep into the account settings. I needed the raw data, the unpolished transaction logs that detailed every single movement of our money over the entire course of our marriage. I requested a comprehensive export of the last 36 months, waiting in tense silence as the massive file generated. The harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room reflected off my small screen, illuminating the digital battlefield I was about to enter. The file loaded a dense spreadsheet filled with thousands of individual data points. To an untrained eye, it was just an endless sea of dates, routing numbers, and transaction codes. To me, it was a perfectly clear map of my husband's betrayal. I started with the most recent catastrophe, the massive wire transfers Derek had executed just hours before our flight. He had moved the money in specific staggered increments, intentionally keeping the amounts just below the threshold that would automatically trigger a manual fraud review by the bank. It was a classic structuring technique, something someone with advanced financial knowledge would utilize to avoid immediate detection. I highlighted the destination routing numbers attached to those final devastating transfers. They did not belong to a standard personal checking account or a recognized brokerage firm. The funds had been funneled directly into a commercial holding account. I took a deep, rattling breath, forcing myself to suppress the sharp sting in my lungs, and began working backward through the spreadsheet. I set up a digital filter isolating every outgoing transfer that matched that specific commercial routing number. The screen instantly repopulated, and the sheer volume of the results made my stomach drop. The transfers had not started today. They had not started last month. The very first transaction matching that exact destination account occurred exactly 3 years ago, just 2 months after we had exchanged our wedding vows. I cross-referenced the dates of those outgoing wire transfers with the deposit dates of my corporate payroll. A sickening, undeniable pattern immediately emerged. Every single time I received a major performance bonus, every time I worked 80-hour weeks and sacrificed my weekends to secure a promotion, a significant portion of that hard-earned money vanished within 48 hours. Derek had always managed our joint finances, insisting his expertise as an investment manager made him the logical choice to handle our portfolio. Whenever I asked about the transferred funds, he smoothly assured me he was locking them into high-yield long-term bonds for our future retirement. He would show me glossy, professional-looking portfolio summaries, praising my hard work and promising that our financial future was completely secure. Those portfolios were entirely fabricated. The money had never been invested in any legitimate bonds or mutual funds. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, furious rhythm against my aching ribs. He had been systematically siphoning my earnings for 3 solid years. I tallied the highlighted columns, watching the cumulative total climb higher and higher, 50,000, 100,000. By the time I reached the bottom of the spreadsheet, the stolen amount exceeded $400,000. Almost $500,000 of my own blood. Sweat and tears quietly drained away while he smiled and kissed my forehead. I needed to know exactly where my life savings had gone. I copied the commercial routing number and accessed a public financial database I frequently used for preliminary corporate audits. I ran a reverse search on the receiving institution, bypassing the privacy walls to identify the registered entity attached to the account. The search engine spun for a few agonizing seconds before returning a single definitive result. The destination was an undisclosed limited liability company registered right here in Illinois. It was a shell corporation, a hollow entity created for the sole purpose of receiving and washing diverted funds. Derek had not simply stolen our vacation money in a fit of spiteful rage. He had constructed a sophisticated multi-year financial scheme designed to silently rob me blind while I worked myself into the ground. He had smiled at me across the dinner table, accepted my expensive anniversary gifts, and slept beside me every single night, all while carefully funneling my money into a shadow account. The magnitude of his deception was breathtaking, but it was also incredibly arrogant. He believed his status as an investment manager made him untouchable. He assumed I would never bother to look behind the curtain of our joint finances, trusting him implicitly as a dutiful wife should. As I sat in that quiet hospital room, clutching my phone with white-knuckled intensity, the last remaining fragments of my love for him evaporated completely. My fever was still raging, and my lungs still burned with every breath, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I had the transaction dates. I had the exact dollar amounts. I had the registration details of the shell company. I was no longer a stranded, heartbroken wife crying in an airport terminal. I was a corporate auditor staring at massive financial fraud, and I was finally ready to destroy my husband. I stared at the blinking cursor on the sterile hospital computer screen, my mind racing faster than my feverish pulse. The anonymous Illinois Limited Liability Company, holding my life savings, had a registered tax identification number attached to its corporate filing. I knew from years of forensic accounting that every shell company has a fatal flaw, a careless paper trail left by people who think they are smarter than the system. I copied the 9-digit tax identifier and pasted it into the state business registry portal. My chest tightened as the loading icons spun in a slow, agonizing circle. The page refreshed, pulling up the unredacted articles of organization. The registered agent listed for the holding account was not some shadowy overseas conglomerate. It was a residential address right here in the upscale suburbs of Chicago. I recognized the street name instantly. It was the exact address of the sprawling, custom-built estate where Derek's sister Chelsea lived with her husband Jamal. I blinked hard, forcing my burning eyes to focus on the names listed under the primary corporate officers. Managing Director Jamal Washington. Principal Financial Officer Chelsea Washington. The sterile room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. Jamal was the sole proprietor of the shell company that had been swallowing my bonuses for the past 3 years. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, every agonizing family dinner we had endured over the last 36 months flashed through my mind with sickening clarity. Jamal had always been the loudest presence in the room, dominating the conversation with endless, arrogant monologues about his brilliant consulting startup. He loved to hold court at the head of the table, swirling a glass of $200 Cabernet, wearing bespoke suits and flashy diamond watches that caught the light when he moved. He would lean back in his leather chair, look directly at me, and offer unsolicited advice on how I was wasting my potential in a traditional corporate environment. He constantly mocked my 9-to-5 job, calling me a slave to the corporate machine, while he was out there building an empire as a visionary entrepreneur. Chelsea would always chime in, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm, loudly wondering why I exhausted myself with endless audit reports when Derek provided such a comfortable life. Derek would just sit there sipping his wine, offering a tight, patronizing smile while his family publicly humiliated my career choices. They had all played their parts flawlessly. The entire time Jamal was mocking my grueling work ethic, he was secretly financing his fake empire with the very paychecks I was breaking my back to earn. His so-called visionary consulting startup produced absolutely no products, offered zero actual services, and held no legitimate client contracts. It was nothing but a hollow bucket designed to catch the hundreds of thousands of dollars Derek was systematically stealing from our joint accounts. My husband had not just been siphoning my money to build a secret nest egg for himself. He had been actively funding his sister and brother-in-law, financing their extravagant lifestyle, their luxury vehicles, their designer wardrobes, and their completely fabricated entrepreneurial success. The depth of the deception was almost impossible to process. I sat in the hard vinyl chair, the cold truth settling deep into my bones, chilling me far more than the blizzard raging outside the hospital walls. My entire marriage had been a carefully orchestrated financial scheme. Derek had not married me because he loved my ambition or respected my intellect. He had married me because he needed a highly compensated, unsuspecting host to act as the primary financial engine for his family. I was nothing more than an automated teller machine, a quiet, compliant wife who trusted her husband, implicitly and blindly handed over the keys to her financial kingdom. The romantic dinners, the anniversary trips, the whispered promises about our future. They were all calculated investments to keep me working, keep me earning, and keep me completely unaware of the massive theft occurring right under my nose. A sharp, rattling cough tore through my chest, forcing me to grip the edge of the desk. The physical pain was a harsh reminder of my current reality, stranded, sick, and stripped of everything I had worked for. But the tears that had threatened to fall earlier were completely gone. The crushing despair had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, methodical fury that sharpened my focus to a razor edge. Derek and his family thought they were dealing with a naive, subservient woman who would simply fade away quietly after being discarded. They believed their convoluted wire transfers and fake corporate entities were sophisticated enough to hide their crimes forever. They were completely wrong. I reached for a stack of blank administrative paper resting next to the keyboard and grabbed a ballpoint pen. I started meticulously copying every single routing number, tax identification code, and transaction date from the digital ledger. I recorded the exact timeline of Jamal and Chelsea corporate filings, cross-referencing them with the dates Derek had executed the largest transfers from my bonus payouts. I built a comprehensive, undeniable paper trail of money laundering and wire fraud right there in the emergency room corridor. My mind operated with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a seasoned auditor tracking down a hostile corporate takeover. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside me. I gathered my handwritten notes, folding the papers carefully and tucking them securely inside the pocket of my hospital gown. I logged out of the secure terminal, erasing the browser history with practiced ease to ensure no one could see the digital footprints I had uncovered. I slowly made my way back to my hospital bed, my body aching with fever, but my spirit entirely transformed. The illusion of my marriage was dead and buried. I knew exactly who they were, what they had done, and precisely how they had executed their theft. Now I just needed to survive this illness, get out of this hospital and prepare to tear their stolen empire down to the ground brick by stolen brick. I pulled my phone back from the edge of the tray table, the screen still warm from my frantic searches, with the financial evidence safely recorded on the stark white hospital paper. A morbid curiosity began to creep into my feverish mind. I needed to see them. I needed to look at the faces of the people who were currently funding their extravagant winter fantasy with my stolen life savings. I opened a new tab on my mobile browser and navigated directly to my social media accounts. For months, I had barely checked my feeds, constantly buried under mountains of corporate audit reports and exhausting overtime hours. Derek had always managed our public image, curating a flawless digital gallery of a happy, affluent couple. I tapped the application icon, bracing myself for whatever performative nonsense they had decided to broadcast to the world. The main feed refreshed, and the very first post at the top of my timeline struck me like a physical blow. It was a high-resolution video uploaded to Chelsea profile just 30 minutes ago. I pressed play, watching the crisp, bright colors of the Aspen ski resort flood my small screen. The camera panned across a massive, luxurious private chalet, featuring soaring timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains. A massive stone fireplace roared in the background, casting a warm, expensive glow over the scene. Chelsea stepped into the frame wearing a pristine white designer snowsuit that easily cost more than my first semester of college tuition. She held a crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne, laughing loudly as she clinked her glass against Jamal's. Jamal looked perfectly in his element, draped in an oversized cashmere sweater, showcasing a brand-new diamond-encrusted watch that caught the firelight perfectly. He grinned into the camera lens, holding up a delicate mother-of-pearl spoon piled high with black beluga caviar. Derek appeared a second later, wrapping his arm securely around his sister's shoulder. My husband looked incredibly relaxed, his cheeks flushed from the cold mountain air and expensive alcohol. There was not a single trace of worry on his handsome face. He did not look like a man whose wife was currently fighting for breath in a freezing hospital room. He looked like a man who had just pulled off the perfect heist, celebrating his victory on a mountaintop. The caption beneath the video made my blood run entirely cold. Chelsea had written a lengthy, boastful paragraph about family bonding and luxury winter escapes. At the very end of the text, she had deliberately tagged my personal account. The wording was sharp, calculated, and deeply malicious. It read, "So sad Melody could not make the trip this year. I guess she chose boring audit reports and dusty spreadsheets over quality family time. Work hard, play hard, right." Derek had commented immediately below the post, leaving a string of laughing emojis and a sarcastic remark about how some people just do not know how to enjoy the finer things in life. They were publicly mocking me. They were using a platform visible to hundreds of our mutual friends, colleagues, and extended family members to paint me as a joyless, work-obsessed drudge who had voluntarily abandoned her own husband on a luxury vacation. They were actively constructing a false narrative to excuse my absence, covering up the brutal reality that they had left me to die in a terminal. Every comment pouring in from their affluent social circle praised their beautiful family dynamic and expressed fake pity for my supposed terrible work-life balance. It was a masterful, sickening display of psychological manipulation and public gaslighting. I stared at the looping video, watching my husband laugh and drink champagne paid for by the sweat of my own brow. A profound, unnatural stillness washed over me. Any ordinary wife might have shattered into a million pieces at that exact moment. A normal person would have thrown the phone across the room, screamed at the injustice, or desperately typed out a furious, tear-stained comment defending her honor. But the fever burning through my veins had incinerated the last remaining traces of the compliant, desperate woman I used to be. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar suffocating weight of inadequacy that Derek had spent 5 years conditioning me to feel. Instead, Watching their brazen, arrogant display of stolen wealth solidified my resolve into something harder than diamonds. Their public humiliation was not a weapon that could hurt me anymore. It was a massive, glaring vulnerability. They were so incredibly confident in their deception, so utterly blinded by their own greed and narcissism, that they felt perfectly comfortable flaunting the evidence of their crimes for the entire world to see. They believed they were untouchable. They believed I was trapped, silenced by illness and financial ruin, incapable of fighting back against their united wealthy front. They had no idea that their arrogant social media posts were providing me with the exact timeline and location data I needed to build an airtight legal case. I took careful, methodical screenshots of every single post, every boastful video, and every mocking comment. I documented the timestamps, the geotags, pinning them to the luxury Aspen chalet, and the clear displays of extravagant spending that vastly exceeded Derek reported legitimate income. Every crystal glass of champagne, every spoonful of imported caviar, and every piece of designer winter gear was added to the mental ledger I was constructing against them. I closed the social media application and locked my phone, resting it gently on the plastic tray table. The sterile silence of the hospital room wrapped around me like a protective shield. I lay back against the pillows, taking slow, deliberate breaths to manage the deep ache in my lungs. The silent grind had officially begun. I was going to leverage their staggering arrogance to fuel my own meticulous preparation. I was finally ready. The sterile hospital room felt entirely different now, transformed from a prison of despair into a tactical command center. I needed a legal representative who possessed the exact same ruthless, methodical approach to corporate warfare that I utilized in my daily audits. Derek believed he held all the power because he managed the investment portfolios, but he fundamentally misunderstood how the legal system dismantled financial criminals. I opened a secure browser window on my phone and bypassed the standard family law practices. A standard divorce attorney would simply seek mediation and a fair split of the marital assets. I was not looking for an equitable division of stolen funds. I was looking for total annihilation. My search zeroed in on the top financial litigators in Chicago, the legal sharks who specialized in asset recovery, corporate fraud, and high-stakes embezzlement. One name consistently dominated the highest tiers of aggressive litigation: Lawyer Maxwell. His firm did not bother with amicable settlements. They specialized in scorched earth campaigns against corrupt executives and white-collar criminals. Maxwell had a fierce, unyielding reputation for stripping fraudulent defendants of every single hidden asset before they even realized they were under investigation. He was exactly the weapon I needed to tear Derek and his family apart. I found his direct emergency contact line, a premium service number reserved for high-net-worth clients facing immediate corporate crises. The hospital clock on the wall read 2 in the morning, but predators in the financial district rarely slept. I dialed the number, my heart maintaining a steady, calculated rhythm. A paralegal answered on the second ring, attempting to politely divert my call to normal business hours. I did not let him finish his scripted greeting. I stated my profession, my exact corporate title, and clearly outlined that I had irrefutable documented proof of a multi-year wire fraud scheme involving a registered Illinois shell company. I told him the stolen amount was approaching $500,000, and that the primary perpetrator was a licensed investment manager who was currently out of the state. I requested an immediate consultation with Lawyer Maxwell, emphasizing that an emergency injunction was required before the banks opened. The paralegal placed me on a brief hold. Less than 2 minutes later, a deep, sharp voice came through the receiver. Maxwell did not offer empty sympathy or useless pleasantries. He demanded facts, routing numbers, and timelines. Lying in my hospital bed, still fighting the burning ache of severe pneumonia, I delivered a flawless, rapid-fire verbal audit. I detailed the precise dates of my bonus payouts, the corresponding wire transfers, and the structural registration of the holding company, controlled by Jamal and Chelsea. I explained Derek and his arrogant social media posts, highlighting how his documented location in Aspen provided the perfect window of opportunity to strike, while he was completely distracted. Maxwell listened in total silence, absorbing the data with the clinical precision of a master tactician. When I finished my summary, I heard the distinctive sound of a heavy pen tapping against a solid mahogany desk. "You have handed me a fully loaded weapon," he finally said, his tone resonating with dark, genuine amusement. "Your husband has committed egregious bank fraud, and he left the architect of his destruction holding the blueprints. We are taking the case." The covert operation began immediately over that encrypted phone line. Maxwell understood that Derek likely assumed my isolated retirement accounts were safe for now, as those required specific spousal authorization and massive tax penalties to liquidate quickly. However, a desperate man enjoying a luxury vacation might attempt to leverage those accounts as collateral once his primary liquid funds ran dry. We needed to erect an impenetrable legal fortress around my remaining assets before sunrise. Working with a dedicated emergency magistrate, Maxwell and his expert litigation team drafted an ex parte injunction. This was a highly specialized legal maneuver intentionally designed to instantly freeze my individual retirement accounts without requiring any notification or consent from my fraudulent husband. The injunction explicitly barred Derek from attempting any unauthorized withdrawals, backdoor electronic transfers, or dangerous financial loans against my protected future earnings. By 4 in the morning, the digital paperwork was entirely complete. I securely signed the binding documents using my smartphone, officially locking Derek out of my final financial safety net. The intense relief that washed over me was utterly intoxicating, a powerful surge of pure adrenaline that forcefully pushed back the lingering exhaustion of my high fever. With the defensive perimeter fully established, we immediately pivoted to our ruthless offensive strategy. Maxwell assigned 2 senior paralegals to begin meticulously drafting a comprehensive, multi-tiered lawsuit. We were not merely filing for standard divorce on the polite grounds of irreconcilable differences. We were actively filing a massive civil litigation suit formally citing extreme financial abuse, malicious breach of fiduciary duty, and premeditated marital fraud. Every single dollar Derek had quietly siphoned into Jamal and his fake consulting startup would be mathematically itemized, legally categorized, and legally weaponized against them. Maxwell promised to aggressively subpoena every relevant bank record, every corporate tax return, and every hidden communication, effectively linking Derek to his brother-in-law and his fraudulent enterprise. He warned me that the upcoming legal battle would be incredibly vicious, as arrogant people like Derek and Chelsea typically responded to legal exposure with aggressive, manipulative counterattacks. They would absolutely attempt to smear my hard-earned professional reputation, maliciously paint me as a vindictive, unstable spouse, and ruthlessly use their affluent social circle to isolate me completely from our mutual friends. I assured him that I was fully prepared for their inevitable smear campaign. I had spent 5 long years quietly absorbing their cruel insults, patiently enduring their endless condescending remarks, and perfectly playing the assumed role of the dutiful, boring corporate auditor. They had fundamentally underestimated my intellectual resilience, and that one fatal misjudgment was undoubtedly going to cost them absolutely everything they currently possessed forever. 2 days later, the attending physician cleared me for discharge. My lungs still harbored a dull, heavy ache, and my legs trembled slightly as I traded the thin hospital gown for a set of generic sweatpants Brenda, the social worker, had kindly sourced for me. The bitter Chicago cold hit my face as I stepped through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. A medical transport vehicle idled by the curb, arranged and paid for by a secure trust account Derek knew nothing about. The driver hopped out, opening the passenger door. He glanced at my chart and asked if we were heading north to Lake Forest. I shook my head, my voice still carrying a slight raspy edge. I gave him an address right in the heart of downtown Chicago, a towering luxury high-rise overlooking the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. As the medical transport navigated the slush-covered highway, I leaned my head against the cold glass window. 6 months ago, my maternal aunt passed away. She was a fiercely independent woman who had built a massive fortune in commercial real estate. She always saw right through Derek. She called him a parasite dressed in cashmere. When the estate was settled, she left me her crown jewel, a sprawling, fully furnished penthouse in one of the most exclusive high-security buildings in the city. The deed was placed in a blind trust, legally insulated from any marital claims. I had never told my husband about it. I knew exactly what Derek would do if he discovered a multi-million-dollar property had landed in my lap. He would have immediately demanded we sell it to fund another one of Jamal's phantom business ventures, or insisted on using it as collateral for his own reckless investments. Keeping that secret was the smartest financial decision I ever made, and right now, it was my only lifeline. The vehicle pulled into a heated subterranean parking garage. A uniformed concierge immediately approached, recognizing my face from the discreet security profile I had established months prior. He welcomed me back, his professional demeanor betraying no judgment of my pale, exhausted appearance or my mismatched, oversized clothing. He escorted me to a private keycard-restricted elevator that shot silently up to the 42nd floor. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung open, revealing a breathtaking sanctuary of absolute quiet and safety. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving the city sparkling under a brilliant, icy afternoon sun. Instead of going home to lick her wounds, Rebecca drove straight to the municipal police precinct. She stomped through the double doors, her designer evening gown swapped for civilian clothes, but her arrogant entitlement remained fully intact. As a newly minted SWAT member, she received elevated security clearances within the municipal law enforcement database. In her inflated arrogance, she genuinely believed this local access granted her absolute authority to investigate anyone anywhere. She marched past the night shift desk sergeant without a word and locked herself inside one of the sterile, brightly lit dispatch offices. Booting up the secure terminal, her fingers flew aggressively across the keyboard. She was absolutely determined to rip my entire life apart. She started with standard background checks, pulling my civilian records, financial history, and registered addresses. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly boring. This only fueled her irrational rage. She convinced herself I hid supposed criminal activities behind fake administrative documents. She decided to dig deeper, secure smartphone and a pristine laptop to be delivered directly to the concierge desk. I was entirely severing my digital footprint from the marital home. Every device Derek had ever touched, every shared cloud account, every compromised password was completely abandoned. I was erasing the vulnerable wife he knew and replacing her with an untouchable phantom. The secure landline on the desk rang loudly, cutting through the perfect silence of the apartment. It was Lawyer Maxwell. His aggressive, sharp voice filled the room, confirming that the emergency injunction had been flawlessly executed. Derek was officially locked out of my retirement funds, and a forensic accounting team was already dissecting the shell company records I had provided from the hospital. Maxwell advised me to remain completely out of sight. He warned that once Derek realized his access to my money was blocked, he would attempt to track me down using his charm to manipulate his way out of the impending disaster. Maxwell instructed me to stay inside the stronghold and avoid any location tied to our joint assets. I assured Maxwell he had nothing to worry about. The building security protocol required physical authorization from me for any guest to pass the lobby. Derek did not even know this address existed, let alone have the clearance to step foot in the elevator. I hung up the phone and walked into the massive master bathroom. I turned on the rainfall shower, letting the scalding water wash away the last lingering smells of the hospital and the bitter sting of the airport blizzard. As the steam filled the room, I mapped out the next crucial phase of my absolute retaliation. I needed eyes and ears inside the Lake Forest property before my husband returned from his extravagant ski trip. I needed to systematically erase my entire existence from that house, leaving him nothing but a hollow shell. I stepped out of the shower, wrapping myself in a thick robe. I poured a glass of cold water and returned to the mahogany desk, pulling up my newly secured contact list. The game was escalating, and from this towering safe haven I held every single advantage. The polished airport tiles felt like solid ice beneath my trembling hands. My vision swam with dark spots as the frantic energy of the terminal swirled around me like an out-of-focus movie. I tried to push myself up, but my exhausted arms gave way entirely, sending me crashing back down against the unforgiving floor. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly, burning my extremely sensitive eyes. Every breath I managed to pull into my burning lungs felt exactly like swallowing jagged glass, accompanied by a wet, rattling wheeze that echoed endlessly in my own ears. Busy travelers stepped around me without pausing, their heavy rolling suitcases clattering loudly across the floor. They were completely absorbed in their frustrating winter storm delays, failing to notice a young woman practically suffocating in plain sight. A sharp pain pierced my chest, radiating straight down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut silently, pleading for Derek to turn around and realize he had made a terrible mistake, but the only sound was the howling wind rattling the tall terminal windows. Suddenly, a pair of heavy black winter boots stopped right beside my face, blocking out the bright overhead light. A deep voice crackled through a radio, sounding loud and remarkably urgent. An airport security officer knelt beside me, his gloved hand resting tentatively on my shivering shoulder. He asked if I could hear him, but when I tried to speak, only a dry, agonizing cough erupted from my raw throat. He immediately shouted into his radio for a medical team, his frantic words blurring together as my consciousness began to fray completely. The next hour became a fragmented nightmare of flashing red lights and urgent voices. I vaguely remember being hoisted onto a narrow stretcher, the thick straps securing me tight as paramedics rushed me swiftly through the sliding glass doors. The sudden blast of sub-zero air hit my feverish skin like a brutal physical blow. Inside the moving ambulance, the piercing wail of the siren cut fiercely through the raging blizzard. A paramedic with kind eyes placed a clear oxygen mask over my face, instructing me to take slow, shallow breaths. He quickly attached cold sensors to my chest and wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm, his dark brow furrowing with deep concern as he read the rapidly dropping numbers aloud. I drifted helplessly in and out of the waking world, the agonizing heat of my fever battling the freezing chill of the snowstorm I had just barely escaped. When I finally opened my eyes with a renewed sense of clarity, the roaring chaos of the airport was completely gone, replaced entirely by the sterile rhythmic beeping of modern hospital machinery. I was lying in a narrow bed inside a dimly lit emergency room bay. A thin intravenous line snaked directly into the back of my hand, delivering a steady cooling stream of vital fluids and powerful antibiotics. A young nurse noticed I was awake and quickly approached with a plastic clipboard. She gently explained that I had been brought in with dangerously low oxygen levels and a core temperature pushing 103 degrees. The official diagnosis was severe acute pneumonia, exacerbated greatly by the freezing temperatures and immense physical stress. I was incredibly lucky the security guard had found me when he did. She then asked for my identification and health insurance information, prompting a fresh, suffocating wave of panic to instantly wash over my exhausted body. I weakly patted the empty pockets of my winter coat, which had been draped over a chair in the corner. Empty. Derek had taken my large suitcase, which securely held my wallet, my driver license, my insurance cards, and my daily prescription medication. All I had left was my cell phone sitting dead and useless on the plastic tray table. I had no charger, no money, and absolutely no way to contact anyone for help. I quickly explained the dire situation to the nurse, my voice reduced to a raspy, painful whisper. Her professional expression shifted immediately to genuine pity, a look I would soon become deeply familiar with. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring blankly at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. The isolation was absolute and crushing. In a sprawling city of millions, I was entirely alone. My husband was currently sipping expensive champagne on a first-class flight to Aspen, completely unbothered that he had abandoned his sick wife in a blizzard. There was no concerned family waiting in the lobby. There were no frantic text messages lighting up my phone. There was only the steady beep of the heart monitor. The hospital room felt less like a place of healing and more like a solitary confinement cell, punishing me for my blind loyalty to a man who viewed me as disposable. A few hours later, a hospital social worker stepped into my room. She introduced herself softly and pulled up a chair beside my bed. She explained that without physical identification or a functional insurance card, processing my admission and treatments would be incredibly difficult. My medical bills were already mounting, and the hospital needed a verified method of payment or a trusted guarantor. She handed me a generic phone charger she had scrounged up from the staff break room, allowing me to finally plug in my dead device. As the battery icon appeared on the black screen, she gently suggested we contact my bank to set up an emergency wire transfer. I thanked her, my throat tight with unshed tears. I ignored the work emails, navigating straight to my mobile banking application. I bypassed the checking account and clicked on the high-yield savings tab. I expected to see the robust six-figure balance I had verified last month. Instead, the numbers on screen shocked me. The balance read absolute zero. My emergency savings were completely gone, stolen by the husband who had just left me to die in the freezing storm. Carmen, the loyal housekeeper, who had maintained the Lake Forest mansion for 3 years, answered my secure call on the first ring. She had always been a quiet, observant woman who silently despised the way Chelsea and Jamal treated her. They would parade through the house, leaving massive, disrespectful messes in their wake, snapping their fingers at her as if she were an invisible servant. Derek was no better, frequently berating her over minor inconveniences while refusing to pay her holiday bonuses. When I offered her a generous severance package from my newly secured trust to act as my inside operative, she did not hesitate for a second. She became the crucial key to unlocking the suburban estate while my husband was busy posting pictures of caviar in Aspen. With Carmen flawlessly managing the ground logistics, I deployed a highly specialized discreet moving company. These were not standard residential movers who parked bulky vans in driveways and took their time carrying boxes. They were a rapid response corporate relocation team specifically accustomed to executing seamless midnight office clearouts for collapsing companies. They charged an astronomical premium for absolute silence and unparalleled speed, and paying for their absolute discretion was worth every single penny. I sat in the safety of my downtown penthouse monitoring the entire operation through a secure encrypted live feed established on my new laptop. Carmen had strategically disabled the interior security cameras that Derek typically monitored from his smartphone, cleverly blaming a temporary internet outage caused by the lingering winter storms. At precisely 1 in the afternoon, 2 large unmarked box trucks backed slowly into the expansive snow-covered driveway of the suburban estate. The moving crew worked with surgical military precision, armed with detailed color-coded inventory I had compiled entirely from memory. They began systematically dissecting the marital home. I had paid 70% of the initial down payment on that massive house, but I had also single-handedly funded the entire interior design budget. Every item of value that I had purchased with my own hard-earned money was swiftly tagged and removed. The custom-imported Italian leather sectional in the grand living room was expertly wrapped in heavy moving blankets and hauled out the front door in a matter of minutes. The expensive abstract art pieces I had carefully curated from local Chicago galleries were taken down from the walls and packed into reinforced wooden crates. The towering solid oak bookshelves in the personal study were stripped completely bare, leaving behind only the cheap generic sports biographies Derek liked to display to impress his shallow golf buddies. The operation extended far beyond mere furniture and decor. The crew meticulously dismantled my entire high-end home theater system, a sophisticated setup Derek loved to brag about when hosting his finance colleagues for Thursday game nights. They disconnected the massive flat-screen televisions, the premium soundbars, and the expensive gaming consoles I had purchased as anniversary gifts. More importantly, they accessed the hidden fireproof safe located deep inside the master bedroom walk-in closet. Using the digital combination I provided, Carmen expertly extracted every single physical document tying me to that property and that marriage. My original birth certificate, my old tax returns, my corporate employment contracts, and all the original closing paperwork for the house were securely sealed in tamper-evident bags and immediately dispatched to Lawyer Maxwell via private courier. We were not vandalizing the house. We were simply returning it to its rightful hollow state. The crew operated with explicit, unwavering instructions to leave Derek and his personal belongings completely untouched. His overpriced designer suits remained hanging perfectly in his half of the master closet. His golf clubs sat undisturbed in the heated garage. His collection of expensive luxury watches, which I now knew with absolute certainty were funded by my stolen corporate bonuses, were left resting neatly on his bare wooden nightstand. The stark contrast between his remaining possessions and the sudden emptiness of the surrounding rooms was incredibly jarring. By 5 in the evening, the Grand Lake Forest mansion had been completely gutted of my presence. The echoing, empty spaces were truly staggering to behold through the camera lens. The massive living room, once filled with warmth, carefully chosen decor, and plush rugs, was reduced to a vast sterile expanse of cold, echoing hardwood floors. The gourmet kitchen, where I had stood for hours, cooking countless elaborate meals for his completely ungrateful family, was systematically stripped of my expensive espresso machines, my premium cookware, and even the imported spices I preferred to use. The house was now exactly like the man who proudly claimed to own it. It was a large, expensive hollow shell, with absolutely nothing of substance or warmth left inside. Carmen walked slowly through the empty rooms, panning her smartphone camera to show me the finalized, desolate landscape. The transformation was breathtaking. I had effectively erased 5 years of my life from that sprawling property in just a few short hours. I thanked Carmen profusely, transferring the promised severance funds directly into her secure bank account, and instructed her to leave the keys on the kitchen counter and take a long, well-deserved vacation. As the unmarked trucks drove away from the property, blending seamlessly into the busy evening commuter traffic, I sat back in the plush leather chair of my downtown penthouse office. The physical extraction was a complete, undeniable success. Derek was going to return from his luxury ski vacation, expecting a hot, home-cooked meal and a defeated, broken wife who had crawled back to him. Instead, he would be walking into a devastating, silent physical representation of his impending total ruin. I closed the laptop, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face as I prepared for the next phase of the financial demolition. The next morning, the harsh winter sun glared off the frost-covered windows of my downtown penthouse. I poured a strong cup of black coffee, feeling the bitter caffeine sharpen my focus, and opened a secure video conference link on my new laptop. Lawyer Maxwell was already online, his expression deadly serious, framed by the towering law books in his immaculate office. We had successfully severed my liquid assets and erased my physical presence from the suburban mansion, but our financial demolition was far from over. Maxwell wanted to meticulously audit the tangible property records, starting with the Lake Forest estate. I had paid 70% of the down payment for that house using my early corporate bonuses, viewing it as a foundational investment for our future. Derek had handled the closing paperwork, leveraging his status as a finance manager to navigate the complex real estate bureaucracy. I trusted him completely back then. I pulled up the county clerk portal and shared my screen with Maxwell, navigating through the labyrinth of public property deeds and municipal tax records. I expected to see the standard primary mortgage, the manageable monthly payment we had mutually agreed upon 5 years ago. Instead, a horrifying new detail materialized on the high-resolution monitor, making the hot coffee in my stomach turn to solid ice. There was a massive secondary lien attached directly to the Lake Forest property. The numbers were staggering. It was a massive second mortgage executed just 3 months ago, effectively stripping every ounce of equity I had painstakingly built into that estate. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I processed the sheer magnitude of this new financial wound. Derek had remortgaged my down payment without breathing a word to me. Maxwell leaned closer to his camera, his sharp eyes scanning the digital document with predatory intensity. He demanded I pull the corresponding disbursement records from the bank that issued the secondary loan. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing standard security hurdles with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned auditor. I tracked the lump sum payout from the mortgage lender. The funds had not been deposited into any of our joint checking accounts. They had not been used for home improvements or long-term investments. The money had been wired instantly to a specialized marine brokerage firm operating out of a high-end coastal marina in southern Florida. Derek had taken out a loan against the roof over my head to purchase a boat. A wave of profound, suffocating anger washed over me, burning far hotter than the pneumonia fever I was still fighting off. I accessed the marine brokerage public registry, cross-referencing the transaction date with the vessel registration database. The search results loaded, revealing a sleek 60-foot luxury yacht. The purchase price perfectly matched the exact dollar amount of the stolen home equity. But the true betrayal lay in the registration details. The vessel was not registered to Derek. It was not registered to our marital estate. The multi-million-dollar luxury watercraft was registered exclusively under the name Jamal Washington. The room seemed to tilt violently. My husband had secretly mortgaged my home to buy a luxury yacht for his arrogant brother-in-law. The sheer audacity of the scheme was absolutely breathtaking. Jamal, the man who constantly mocked my traditional career at every family dinner, was currently sailing on a vessel financed completely by my stolen security. Every condescending remark Jamal had ever made about his visionary consulting startup echoed mockingly in my ears. He loved to brag about his phenomenal business acumen and his impeccable taste in luxury assets. He had likely flaunted that exact yacht to his wealthy social circle, claiming it was the hard-earned fruit of his entrepreneurial genius. Meanwhile, the actual funding had been ripped directly from the equity of the house I worked 80-hour weeks to secure. Chelsea had undoubtedly lounged on the deck of that stolen vessel, sipping expensive champagne and complaining about how I was too boring to appreciate the finer things in life. They were parasites, a family of financial vampires draining my lifeblood to fund their pathetic, flashy illusions of grandeur. Maxwell interrupted my racing thoughts, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. He pointed out the critical legal implication of this discovery. For Derek to secure a second mortgage of that massive magnitude on a jointly owned property, he would have absolutely needed my explicit notarized consent. A bank would never approve the disbursement without the verified signatures of both primary deed holders. I stared at the screen, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. I had never seen a single piece of paperwork for this secondary loan. I had never sat in front of a notary public, and I had never authorized the liquidation of our home equity to purchase a boat for Jamal. This was no longer just a case of an unethical husband siphoning discretionary income into a hidden shell company. This was a deliberate, highly orchestrated criminal act. Derek had crossed a massive legal threshold, escalating his deceit from quiet marital embezzlement to brazen institutional fraud. He had actively deceived a major financial institution, manipulating the fundamental legal architecture of our property rights to feed his family's insatiable greed. The financial demolition was no longer just about securing a favorable divorce settlement. It was about exposing a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. I downloaded the entire loan application packet, securing the digital files in multiple encrypted folders. I zoomed in on the final page of the mortgage agreement, my eyes locking onto the signature line. There, written in striking blue ink across the dotted line, was a flawless, absolutely perfect forgery of my legal name. The intricate loops and precise slants had been painstakingly copied, a silent testament to how thoroughly Derek had planned to ruin me. A freezing cold, highly dangerous calm settled deeply over my entire body as I prepared for total war. The glaring blue ink on the final page of the mortgage agreement held my complete attention. I stared at the screen, my heart beating with a steady mechanical rhythm. To an untrained eye, the signature looked remarkably authentic. It possessed the same aggressive loops and distinct sharp angles I used whenever I signed official corporate audit reports. Derek had clearly spent hours practicing my handwriting, studying the exact way I crossed my letters and the specific pressure I applied to the paper. But a seasoned auditor knows that a forgery always leaves microscopic clues. I magnified the high-resolution scan by 400%, bringing the digital ink into sharp, undeniable focus. The deception immediately revealed itself in the tiny, almost invisible hesitation marks. When a person signs their own name, the pen glides across the paper with fluid, unbroken confidence. The signature on the mortgage document showed distinct, unnatural pauses. There were microscopic pools of ink at the apex of the loops, proving that the person holding the pen had slowed down to carefully control the direction of the stroke. It was a calculated imitation, totally lacking the natural muscle memory of my actual handwriting. The sheer audacity of the crime was almost impossible to process. Derek had not simply signed a meaningless household document. He had executed a legally binding financial contract with a major national bank, placing a massive lien on a multi-million-dollar property. I needed to establish a completely airtight chain of evidence to prove that I was nowhere near the closing table when this catastrophic document was signed. I scrolled down to the notary public seal stamped directly beneath the forged signature. The notary was an independent contractor operating out of a small commercial plaza in the western suburbs, nowhere near Derek regular financial offices. This was a deliberate choice. He had selected a remote notary who would not recognize my face or question the legitimacy of the woman sitting beside him. I opened my personal calendar application and cross-referenced the exact date and time stamped on the notary's seal. The closing had occurred on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15. I immediately accessed my secure corporate email archive. On that specific Tuesday at that exact time, I was leading a mandatory compliance seminar for 70 junior auditors in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Chicago. I had digital calendar invites, security badge swipe records, and 70 eyewitnesses to prove my absolute physical location. I was 20 miles away from that suburban notary office when someone else signed away the equity of my home. But I needed more than just an alibi. I needed to know exactly who had impersonated me. I dug deeper into the digital mortgage file hunting for the required identification logs. Every notary public is legally mandated to record the driver license number of the person signing a high-value property deed. I found the supplemental identification form attached to the back of the packet. The license number recorded by the notary matched my actual identification perfectly. Derek had somehow procured a counterfeit identification card, likely using my stolen personal information to create a fake driver license bearing the photograph of his accomplice. The identity of the accomplice was not a mystery. It did not take a forensic genius to figure out who would willingly assist Derek in committing massive federal bank fraud to secure a luxury yacht for Jamal. Chelsea was the exact same height as me, with a similar build and coloring. With a pair of oversized sunglasses, a surgical mask citing a fake winter cold, and my stolen personal details, she could easily pass as me during a brief perfunctory notary appointment. The entire family was complicit in this staggering criminal conspiracy. I picked up my secure smartphone and immediately dialed Lawyer Maxwell. The line connected instantly. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him to pull up the mortgage documents I had just forwarded to his secure server. I instructed him to look closely at the notary seal and the timestamp. I then sent him the irrefutable proof of my corporate alibi, including the building security logs and the conference room attendance sheets. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line as Maxwell processed the sheer magnitude of the evidence I had just handed him. This was the kill shot. The situation had instantly transformed from a bitter high-stakes divorce into a major federal crime. Embezzling marital funds was one thing, but defrauding a federally insured financial institution using forged signatures and stolen identities was a catastrophic escalation. Bank fraud of this magnitude carried severe mandatory minimum prison sentences. Derek had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. Maxwell's voice dropped an octave, resonating with a dangerous predatory excitement. He confirmed that this discovery gave us the ultimate leverage. We were no longer just preparing a civil lawsuit. We were packaging a comprehensive criminal dossier for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Maxwell instructed me to continue locking down my digital footprint. He was dispatching a private investigator to pay a highly discreet visit to the suburban notary office. We needed to secure the physical logbook and any available security camera footage before Derek realized his entire operation was exposed. The private investigator would obtain the necessary affidavits to prove that the woman who presented my counterfeit identification was definitely not me. Every single moving part of their fraudulent scheme was being systematically dismantled and weaponized against them. I ended the call and leaned back in my heavy leather desk chair. The stunning view of the Chicago skyline stretched out before me, the towering skyscrapers reflecting the cold, brilliant winter sun. My husband had spent 5 years constructing an intricate web of financial lies, using my relentless work ethic to fund his family, arrogant, flashy lifestyle. He thought he was a mastermind, a brilliant financial manager who could effortlessly manipulate his naive wife and outsmart the banking system. He was wrong. He was nothing but a careless, greedy amateur who had left a trail of undeniable evidence leading straight back to his own front door. The trap was fully set, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut completely. The trap was set, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. I spent 24 hours methodically organizing digital evidence into encrypted folders on my secure laptop. Every forged signature, hidden wire transfer, and counterfeit identification was perfectly cataloged. I felt an exhilarating sense of control inside my penthouse. But financial warfare is rarely one-sided, and my illusion of control shattered the next afternoon. I was sitting at the desk when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet apartment. The concierge had strict orders to block anyone without my authorization. Adrenaline hit my chest as I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Standing out in the hallway was not Derek or Chelsea, but a professional process server holding a thick manila envelope. The concierge stood behind him, apologizing through the intercom that court-appointed couriers carried legal authority to bypass security protocols. I opened the door, maintaining a neutral expression. The server handed me the envelope, verified my identity, and walked away without another word. My fingers felt numb as I tore open the seal, expecting a desperate divorce filing from a husband who realized he was locked out of his accounts. Instead, I pulled out an aggressively worded collection notice, accompanied by a legal subpoena. The header belonged to a notorious high-risk commercial lending firm located in the financial district. They were predatory lenders, the kind of aggressive institution that fronted high-interest capital to risky ventures when traditional banks refused. I scanned the demand letter, my eyes widening in horror. The firm demanded immediate repayment of an outstanding corporate loan totaling $250,000. The primary debtor listed on the account was Jamal Washington. The room started to spin as the sheer gravity of the document settled over me. Jamal had not just been siphoning my bonus checks to fund his fake startup. He had borrowed $250,000 in high-interest capital to fund his extravagant lifestyle. But the lender was not coming after Jamal. They were coming after me. I flipped to the second page, hunting for the legal justification tying my name to this disastrous debt. I found it buried in the guarantor section of the loan application. Derek had not simply signed as a character witness for his brother-in-law. He explicitly guaranteed the entire $250,000 loan using my professional credentials as collateral. Derek submitted my active certified public accountant license number, my auditing credentials, and a counterfeit employment letter, claiming I was the chief financial officer of Jamal non-existent consulting firm. He weaponized my spotless professional reputation, leveraging the trust banks placed in licensed auditors to secure a massive line of credit for a man who had never worked a legitimate day in his life. The collateral agreement stipulated that if the debtor defaulted, the lender had the right to seize the guarantor assets and garnish their wages. Jamal had predictably defaulted on the loan 3 months ago, perfectly timing his financial collapse with our Aspen vacation. A cold, suffocating dread wrapped tightly around my throat. This was not just a threat to my personal finances. This was a direct, lethal strike against my entire career. In the corporate auditing world, reputation is the only currency that matters. If a high-risk commercial lender formally reported to the state licensing board that I was the defaulting guarantor on a fraudulent corporate loan, my certified public accountant license would be suspended immediately pending a humiliating investigation. I would be instantly terminated from my firm, blacklisted from the financial sector, and publicly disgraced before I even had the chance to prove my innocence. Derek ensured that if his financial schemes ever unraveled, I would be dragged down into the mud alongside them. I grabbed my smartphone and immediately dialed Lawyer Maxwell. The calmness I had felt an hour ago was gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable urgency. Maxwell answered, and I quickly read the contents of the subpoena aloud, detailing the exact nature of the fraudulent agreement. I heard the sharp scratch of his pen against paper as he calculated the immediate threat to my professional livelihood. The timeline we had carefully constructed just went out the window, Maxwell stated, his voice devoid of comforting warmth. This lender will not wait for a divorce settlement. They will move to garnish your corporate wages by the end of the week, which will trigger an automatic internal review by your employer. We have to accelerate the counterattack. Maxwell instructed me to immediately draft a sworn affidavit, explicitly denying any knowledge of the commercial loan, and stating that my professional credentials had been stolen and utilized without my consent. We needed to file a preemptive strike against the lending institution, securing an emergency stay of collection before they could initiate the wage garnishment process. But Maxwell also delivered a harsh reality check. A civil stay would only delay the collection agency temporarily. To permanently clear my name and protect my hard-earned license, we needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the loan itself was a product of a coordinated criminal enterprise. I hung up the phone and stared out the windows. The icy waters of Lake Michigan reflected the harsh winter sun, matching the cold determination hardening in my chest. Derek and Jamal thought they could use my career as a human shield. They believed my fear of professional ruin would force me to quietly absorb their debts and cover their tracks. They were both profoundly and catastrophically mistaken. I sat back down at the mahogany desk and cracked my knuckles. I had exactly 3 days to mathematically deconstruct a $250,000 commercial loan and deliver the undeniable proof of their fraud to the federal authorities. I pulled up the highly encrypted financial software on my laptop, fully ready to turn their weaponized debt into the exact undeniable instrument of their absolute permanent destruction. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark penthouse office as I worked relentlessly through the night. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. I had 72 hours to dismantle a $250,000 commercial loan and sever my stolen professional credentials from Jamal's fraudulent enterprise. I imported the scanned subpoena and the attached loan application into my forensic accounting software. My software utilized advanced optical character recognition to break down the fake employment letter Derek had submitted to the predatory lender. The metadata, hidden deep within the counterfeit document, revealed the exact creation date and the registered software license used to forge the letterhead. The digital footprint traced directly back to a personal computer located at the Lake Forest mansion. Derek had literally manufactured the evidence of his own federal crime from our home office. I systematically mapped the flow of the stolen loan capital. The high-risk lender had dispersed the $250,000 into the primary operating account of Jamal Fake Consulting Startup. From there, the money did not go toward payroll, vendor contracts, or legitimate corporate expenses. Instead, the ledger showed immediate massive withdrawals routed to high-end luxury dealerships, exclusive jewelry boutiques, and private offshore holding accounts. Jamal was actively laundering the borrowed commercial funds through his shell company to sustain his arrogant lifestyle, and Derek was the fully complicit financial architect, making it all possible. I combined this new devastating financial map with the comprehensive evidence I had already gathered regarding the forged secondary home mortgage and the stolen corporate bonuses. I merged the wire transfer logs, the fake notary stamps, the unredacted articles of organization, and my ironclad corporate alibi into a single master audit portfolio. I categorized every single transaction by its specific federal violation, clearly highlighting the corresponding statutes for wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, and international money laundering. I printed the entire dossier on the heavy laser printer in my office, sliding the towering stack of crisp white pages into a thick black leather binder. The weight of the binder in my hands felt like pure concentrated justice. At 8 in the morning, I walked out of my high-security building and stepped into a waiting private car. I instructed the driver to head straight to the financial district. Lawyer Maxwell was waiting for me in his corner suite, drinking a glass of sparkling water and reviewing the preliminary civil filings. I dropped the heavy black binder onto his glass conference table. The sharp thud echoed loudly across the room. I told him the civil stay for the debt collection was no longer our primary objective. I instructed him to cancel the defensive strategy entirely because we were immediately moving to a catastrophic offensive strike. Maxwell opened the binder and spent 20 minutes reading through my meticulously structured audit. His aggressive predatory demeanor sharpened with every page he turned. He looked up, a rare genuine smile of absolute predatory approval crossing his face. He reached for his secure desk phone and dialed a direct number. He did not call a local police precinct or a standard civil judge. He called the special agent in charge of the white-collar crime division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago field office. He informed the agent that he was holding a fully wrapped, undisputed federal indictment with a neat bow tied around it. 2 hours later, we walked into a highly secure, windowless conference room located deep inside the Dirksen Federal Building. 2 senior FBI agents and a seasoned criminal investigator from the Internal Revenue Service sat across the table. They were typically skeptical of spousal revenge claims, accustomed to angry partners making wild, unsubstantiated financial accusations during bitter divorces. I did not give them a chance to doubt me. I stood at the head of the long wooden table and delivered a flawless rapid-fire forensic presentation. I walked them through the fake startup registration, the forged mortgage documents, and the weaponized commercial loan. I provided the exact routing numbers, the timestamps, and the irrefutable proof of my stolen professional credentials. The federal agents did not interrupt me once. They meticulously examined the physical evidence, comparing the forged signatures against my verified identification and my airtight corporate alibi. The IRS investigator immediately flagged the unredacted corporate tax returns Derek had filed for Jamal Shell Company, noting the blatant discrepancies between the reported revenue and the massive untaxed luxury purchases. The FBI agents exchanged a silent, definitive look. One of them closed the binder and firmly stated that my husband and his brother-in-law had executed a textbook multi-tiered embezzlement and money laundering operation. He confirmed that the evidence I provided was beyond substantial. It was an absolute prosecutorial slam dunk. The federal machinery shifted into immediate quiet motion. The agents informed us that they were initiating a sealed federal investigation to prevent Derek or Jamal from attempting to flee the state or destroy digital evidence. They began drafting emergency search warrants right there in the conference room. The warrants specifically targeted the physical address of Jamal fake consulting startup, his luxury vehicles, and Derek highly guarded office at the downtown investment firm. The IRS investigator initiated a simultaneous asset freeze on all accounts linked to the fraudulent limited liability company, ensuring that the stolen funds could not be moved offshore. Maxwell and I walked out of the federal building into the freezing afternoon air. The threat to my certified public accountant license had been completely neutralized by the active federal intervention. The collection agency would be strictly prohibited from pursuing any action against me, while the FBI dismantled the fraudulent loan. I pulled my thick winter coat tightly around my shoulders, looking up at the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. Derek was scheduled to return from his arrogant Aspen ski trip in just a few days. He was coming home expecting to find a financially ruined, terrified wife, desperately trying to salvage her career. Instead, he was flying directly into the crosshairs of a massive, inescapable federal dragnet. The ultimate trap was fully armed, and I was perfectly positioned to watch it spring. The massive federal machinery quietly ground into motion, and I returned to the impenetrable quiet of my downtown high-rise. The heavy oak door sealed shut behind me, locking out the freezing Chicago wind and the chaotic noise of the busy financial district. I shed my thick winter coat and walked directly to my mahogany desk. The federal authorities were handling the massive criminal fraud, but I still had critical domestic housekeeping to finish today. Derek had spent 5 years treating me like an automated teller machine, relying on my steady corporate income to effortlessly maintain his illusion of massive wealth. It was finally time to pull the plug completely on his suburban fantasy. I opened my encrypted laptop and brought up a detailed master checklist I had compiled over the past few days. My primary target was obviously the sprawling Lake Forest mansion. Derek had fraudulently secured a second mortgage on that property, but the primary mortgage, the massive monthly payment that actually kept the roof over his head, was still tied directly to my corporate payroll account. I logged into the bank portal and navigated to the automated payment scheduler. With a single, deliberate keystroke, I permanently canceled the recurring transfer for the primary mortgage. The bank system flashed a bright warning message indicating that a missed payment of this magnitude would trigger immediate default protocols and aggressive collection notices. I clicked confirm without a fraction of a second of hesitation. Next, I moved on to the essential domestic utilities. Derek was a man who demanded absolute comfort at all times. He kept the massive suburban house heated to a balmy 72 degrees all winter, ran the heated floors constantly, and demanded ultra-high-speed internet. I accessed the municipal energy portal and the regional water authority dashboard. One by one, I systematically revoked my credit card authorizations for the electricity, the natural gas, the municipal water, and the internet service provider. I simply removed the payment methods, ensuring that the next billing cycle would bounce immediately. Within a few short days, the sprawling mansion would be plunged into freezing darkness. My financial purge was not restricted to the real estate. I pulled up the leasing agreements for Derek's stable of luxury vehicles. He loved to parade around the city in a top-of-the-line imported German sports car, claiming it projected the necessary image of a highly successful investment manager. He had also leased a massive sport utility vehicle specifically for their extravagant ski trips. The monthly lease payments for both vehicles were absolutely exorbitant, and naturally, they were auto-drafted from a joint checking account I had primarily funded. I disabled those automated drafts with immense satisfaction. I knew exactly how predatory luxury auto lenders operated. The moment those payments bounced, their internal recovery departments would immediately flag the vehicles for aggressive repossession. Derek was going to return to find his prized cars actively hunted by tow trucks. Shutting off the money was only half the battle. I needed to ensure that Derek remained completely blind to the impending catastrophic collapse of his life. If the banks and utility companies started sending angry default notices and foreclosure warnings to the Lake Forest address, he might catch wind of the disaster too early and attempt to run. I needed to completely control the flow of information. I logged into the Federal Postal Service portal and submitted a comprehensive change of address request for the entire Lake Forest property. I legally rerouted every single piece of physical mail, every bank statement, every utility warning, and every legal notification directly to Lawyer Maxwell, secure corporate office in the financial district. Maxwell team had agreed to intercept and catalog the incoming avalanche of default notices. This strategic mail diversion guaranteed that the Lake Forest mailbox would remain completely empty, devoid of any warnings. Derek would step off his flight from Aspen, utterly convinced that his financial fortress was still perfectly intact, completely unaware that I had systematically dismantled his entire life from behind a computer screen. He thought he controlled the board, but I had quietly removed every single piece while he was not looking. With the final automated payment severed and the mail successfully rerouted, my master checklist was completely finished. I logged out of all the portals, closed the laptop, and pushed my heavy leather chair back from the desk. The sheer magnitude of what I had accomplished over the past few days finally settled over me. I had survived a life-threatening illness that left me gasping on an airport floor, uncovered a staggering financial conspiracy that drained my savings, secured a federal indictment against the thieves, and effectively erased my entire existence from their treacherous lives. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The winter sun was beginning to set over Lake Michigan, casting long dramatic shadows across the icy water below. The stage was perfectly set for their downfall. The trap was fully armed, the bait was placed, and the exits were completely sealed. I poured myself a glass of cold, filtered water, relishing the soothing feeling against my raw throat. I sank into the plush sofa in the center of my living room, pulling a soft cashmere throw blanket tightly over my legs to ward off the chill. I picked up my smartphone and checked the calendar application just one more time to verify the exact return date. Derek, Chelsea, and Jamal were scheduled to fly back to Chicago in precisely 48 hours. They were likely packing their expensive ski gear, laughing loudly about their perfect vacation, and eagerly anticipating a warm, luxurious return to their stolen suburban castle. I leaned my head back against the plush cushions and smiled into the absolute quiet emptiness of my downtown safe haven. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the agonizing inevitable wait. The landing gear of the luxury commercial airliner touched down heavily on the freezing tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. It was officially day 13 of my meticulous financial demolition, and the primary targets had just re-entered the active strike zone. Inside the first-class cabin, Derek, Chelsea, and Jamal were completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting for them. They were still riding the euphoric high of their stolen Aspen vacation, deeply intoxicated by a false sense of absolute invincibility. Jamal stretched his long legs loudly adjusting the expensive cashmere scarf draped around his neck. I was boasting to a nearby flight attendant about the pristine powder on the exclusive mountain slopes, making sure to accidentally flash his diamond-encrusted watch for maximum visual impact. Chelsea sat beside him, casually scrolling through her perfectly curated social media feed, admiring the hundreds of likes and envious comments pouring in on her luxury winter aesthetic. Derek simply leaned back in his plush leather seat, sipping the last drops of a complimentary sparkling water, looking like a man who had successfully conquered the entire world. He honestly believed his complex web of financial deceit was still operating flawlessly in the background. The three of them disembarked the aircraft, grabbing their heavy designer luggage and walking briskly into the bustling Chicago terminal. This was the exact same sprawling building where they had ruthlessly abandoned me just under 2 weeks ago. They strolled past the very concrete pillar where I had collapsed, completely unbothered by the memory of my agonizing fever and desperate pleas. In their profoundly arrogant minds, my suffering was nothing more than a minor, temporary inconvenience that they had successfully managed to evade. They were entirely focused on complaining about the bitter Midwestern cold that had replaced the crisp, glamorous mountain air of Colorado. Chelsea shivered dramatically, clutching her bright white snow jacket tightly around her shoulders, whining that the airport heating system was absolutely unacceptable for priority passengers. Jamal laughed his booming, arrogant laugh, assuring his wife that they would be back in the warm, sprawling comfort of the Lake Forest mansion within the hour. Derek walked slightly ahead of them, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. He was ready to resume his role as the commanding husband, fully expecting his compliant wife to be waiting at home, eager to apologize for ruining the start of his precious trip. Derek unlocked his screen and navigated directly to the dedicated family group chat. He did not bother to type out a private personal message to check on my health or ask if my severe pneumonia had finally cleared up. Instead, he treated me exactly like an automated domestic servant, whose only purpose was to facilitate his ultimate comfort. His thumbs flew across the digital keyboard, drafting a message dripping with breathtaking entitlement and sharp condescension. The text popped up in the group chat, visible to Chelsea and Jamal, so they could silently applaud his firm, authoritative marital boundaries. The message read that their flight had just landed, and the Aspen trip was a monumental, unparalleled success. He bragged about the exclusive caviar tastings and the pristine ski runs, purposely twisting the knife to remind me of the luxury I had missed. Then came the direct, unyielding command. He ordered me to have a hot, home-cooked meal, waiting on the dining room table, the exact moment they walked through the front doors of the suburban estate. He specified that they were exhausted from traveling and had absolutely no desire to wait for a delivery driver in the freezing weather. Miles away from the chaotic airport terminal, I sat comfortably in the deep leather chair of my secure downtown penthouse. The heavy oak doors were firmly locked, and the ambient temperature was a perfect, soothing 70 degrees. The encrypted smartphone resting on the sleek mahogany desk suddenly vibrated, illuminating the dark room with a bright notification banner. I picked up the device, unlocking the screen to view the incoming communication from the family group chat. I read Derek's arrogant, commanding words, carefully absorbing the sheer magnitude of his delusion. I was demanding a hot dinner in a house that currently had no electricity, no natural gas, and absolutely zero furniture. He was bragging about a luxury vacation funded by money that the federal authorities had already traced, documented, and flagged for a massive criminal indictment. I did not feel a single trace of the suffocating anxiety that used to paralyze me whenever he issued his harsh domestic demands. I did not feel the frantic, desperate urge to rush into a kitchen and start cooking to appease his volatile temper. I simply stared at the illuminated screen, reading the hostile words over and over again. The contrast between his supreme confidence and his impending doom was truly intoxicating. I imagined him standing in the airport pickup zone, wrapping his expensive coat around his body, fully believing he was heading back to a life of guaranteed luxury and domestic obedience. I imagined Chelsea and Jamal standing right beside him, completely ignorant of the fact that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already cataloged every single fraudulent purchase they had made over the last 3 years. The entire foundation of their arrogant existence had been entirely eradicated, and they were willfully marching straight into the blast radius of a staggering legal explosion. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, stretching my cheeks for the first time in 13 days. I did not type out a defensive reply. I did not bother crafting a clever, sarcastic response. I simply swiped my thumb across the smooth glass, intentionally leaving the notification marked as fully read. I set the phone face down on the polished mahogany wood, returning my full attention to the stunning sunset reflecting over the freezing lake. The long, silent grind was over. The trap was sprung, and I was going to enjoy the absolute silence right up until the moment his world shattered. The heavy tires of the luxury sport utility vehicle crunched loudly over the frozen gravel of the expansive Lake Forest driveway. Derek slammed the transmission into park, letting out a heavy sigh of deep annoyance as he stared through the frosted windshield. The sprawling suburban mansion stood completely dark against the freezing night sky, not a single exterior light illuminating the grand entryway. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenching with immediate frustration. He had sent explicit, direct instructions to the family group chat hours ago, demanding a hot meal and a warm, welcoming environment upon their return from Aspen. Instead, the house looked entirely abandoned, presenting a cold, uninviting facade that deeply offended his profound sense of entitlement. Chelsea groaned from the back seat, complaining bitterly about the bitter Midwestern temperature as she wrapped her bright white designer snow jacket tightly around her shoulders. Jamal muttered a sharp complaint about my supposed sheer incompetence, loudly wondering how hard it could possibly be for a wife to leave a few porch lights on for her exhausted husband. Derek gritted his teeth, promising them both that he would handle my unacceptable behavior the moment they stepped inside. He forcefully shoved the driver's side door open and marched up the brick pathway, his expensive winter boots leaving deep, aggressive tracks in the fresh snow. He fully expected to find me cowering in the kitchen, frantically trying to assemble a delayed dinner, while apologizing profusely for my completely ruined airport stunt. He shoved his brass key into the front door and twisted the lock with sharp, aggressive force. The heavy mahogany door swung open, but the familiar, comforting chime of the digital security system was completely absent. An unnatural, bone-chilling silence rushed out from the grand foyer to greet him. The air inside the house was absolutely freezing, hovering dangerously close to the sub-zero temperature of the winter storm outside. Derek immediately slapped the brass light switch on the wall, fully expecting the towering crystal chandelier above the entryway to flood the space with a warm, welcoming glow. Nothing happened. The entire house remained swallowed by heavy, oppressive darkness. Derek shouted my name into the pitch-black void, his voice echoing sharply off the bare walls with a strange, unnatural resonance. The acoustics of the massive house sounded fundamentally wrong, hollowed out and completely devoid of the usual soft domestic muffling. Chelsea and Jamal stepped through the doorway behind him, instantly shivering as the freezing indoor air hit their faces. Chelsea pulled out her expensive smartphone, activating the bright LED flashlight, and swinging the sharp beam across the expansive entryway. The bright circle of light swept across the grand living room, cutting through the heavy shadows and revealing an absolutely staggering, incomprehensible reality. The room was entirely empty. The custom-imported Italian leather sectional that had anchored the massive space was completely gone. The expensive hand-woven Persian rugs that normally warmed the polished hardwood floors had vanished. The carefully curated abstract paintings I had personally sourced from local downtown galleries were stripped from the walls, leaving behind nothing but small bare picture hooks, casting tiny shadows in the flashlight beam. Jamal stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the vast hollow chamber. He swept his own phone light toward the adjacent formal dining room, finding an identical scene of total desolation. The massive oak dining table, the plush velvet chairs, and the expensive crystal centerpieces had been completely eradicated. Derek stood frozen in the entryway, his mind violently rejecting the visual evidence before him. He shouted my name again, the sound carrying a new jagged edge of genuine panic mixed with rising fury. He stomped aggressively toward the gourmet kitchen, convinced this was some elaborate, highly dramatic tantrum designed to punish him for the airport incident. But as the flashlights illuminated the sprawling culinary space, the sheer, undeniable finality of the situation struck him like a physical blow. The premium espresso machines, the expensive imported cookware, and every single appliance I had purchased with my corporate bonuses were completely missing. The kitchen was a sterile, stripped-down shell of its former glory. Chelsea began whining loudly, her shrill voice bouncing obnoxiously off the bare kitchen cabinets. She accused me of throwing a pathetic hysterical fit, insisting I had hidden the furniture in a storage unit just to be incredibly petty and ruin their victorious homecoming. Jamal scoffed aggressively, checking his diamond watch and demanding Derek fix the broken electrical breaker so they could at least order expensive takeout in the warmth. But Derek was no longer listening to their arrogant complaints. His expensive winter boots pounded heavily against the hardwood stairs as he sprinted toward the second floor, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. He practically tore the master bedroom door off its hinges, sweeping his phone light frantically across the freezing empty suite. My expensive vanity was gone. My bedside table was removed. He stormed violently into the massive walk-in closet, his hands shaking as the harsh light revealed the final devastating truth of the entire physical extraction. His own expensive designer suits still hung perfectly aligned on his side of the custom closet. His luxury shoes were neatly arranged on the floor. His collection of flashy, expensive watches sat completely undisturbed on his bare nightstand. But my side of the massive closet was completely stripped down to the bare drywall. Every garment, pair of shoes, and piece of jewelry had been permanently removed. Derek stumbled backward, his gaze locking onto the back wall where the hidden fireproof safe was mounted. The heavy steel door hung wide open, the internal compartments hollowed out. Every vital document tying me to that property, his fraudulent finances and his treacherous life, had been evacuated. He stood alone in the absolute darkness, his breath pluming in the freezing air, realizing the quiet, compliant wife he so casually discarded at the airport had systematically erased her entire existence from his world. Derek staggered backward out of the cavernous closet, his expensive boots catching on the bare hardwood floor as his panicked mind desperately tried to rationalize the terrifying emptiness surrounding him. He refused to believe that I had successfully outmaneuvered him. In his supreme arrogance, he convinced himself that this was merely an elaborate, hysterical stunt. He assumed I had hired a local storage company to temporarily hide my belongings just to punish him for the airport incident. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the master suite, his heavy footsteps thundering down the grand staircase as he screamed my name into the freezing, echoing darkness. Chelsea and Jamal were waiting in the grand foyer, shivering violently in their luxury winter gear. Chelsea was loudly complaining that her phone battery was dying, and the lack of wireless internet was completely unacceptable. Jamal aggressively paced the perimeter of the room, shining his phone flashlight into the stripped formal dining room, demanding to know where I had hidden the expensive crystal decanters he liked to drink from. Derek ignored their arrogant complaints, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He marched purposefully toward the gourmet kitchen, absolutely certain he would find me cowering in the dark, waiting to tearfully surrender and apologize for my dramatic rebellion. He swept his bright smartphone light across the vast, gutted culinary space, illuminating the bare granite countertops, and the empty stainless steel shelving. He roared my name one more time, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw anger and creeping undeniable dread. The silence that followed was not broken by my voice. Instead, a calm, steady set of footsteps echoed from the deep shadows of the walk-in pantry. Derek froze, shifting his bright beam of light toward the noise, fully expecting to see me emerge. But it was not me. Carmen, the loyal housekeeper they had all spent years treating like absolute garbage, stepped smoothly into the center of the freezing kitchen. She was not wearing her usual domestic uniform. She was dressed in a sharp professional winter coat, her posture impeccably straight-looking, entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature of the dark mansion. She stood bathed in the harsh light of Derek's own phone, exuding a quiet, lethal confidence that immediately stopped him dead in his tracks. Derek lowered his phone slightly, his eyes widening in complete shock. He demanded to know what on earth was going on and why the house was completely destroyed. Carmen did not flinch at his aggressive tone. She simply stared at him with eyes full of cold, profound satisfaction, silently savoring the exquisite power shift. Derek stepped closer, his voice rising to a frantic, demanding shout as he asked her directly where his wife had been hiding. Carmen reached into the deep pocket of her tailored winter coat. She did not tremble and she did not rush. With perfect, deliberate precision, she pulled out a massive, heavy stack of thick legal documents bound securely by thick rubber bands. She walked forward and dropped the towering stack of paperwork directly onto the bare granite island. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the empty kitchen, sounding exactly like a judge bringing down a wooden gavel. Next, she pulled out the master set of brass house keys and tossed them onto the counter right beside the legal files. They landed with a sharp, final clatter. Derek stared at the paperwork, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, as he tried to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. Chelsea and Jamal had followed him into the kitchen, their arrogant complaints dying instantly in their throats as they registered the supreme authority radiating from the former housekeeper. Carmen looked Derek dead in the eyes, delivering the final devastating blow with flawless execution. She told him clearly and calmly that I was not his wife anymore. She then pointed directly at the heavy stack of legal files and delivered the ultimate cinematic payoff, informing him that my lawyer said he had exactly 2 hours to vacate this foreclosed property before the local authorities arrived to physically remove him. The words hung in the freezing air, striking Derek with the destructive force of a massive earthquake. The blood drained entirely from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. Chelsea let out a sharp gasp of pure horror, instinctively grabbing Jamal's arm as the reality of the word foreclosed pierced her thick skull. Jamal stumbled backward, his flashy diamond watch catching the beam of the flashlight as his arrogant demeanor completely evaporated into thin air. Derek lunged forward, his shaking hands tearing at the thick rubber bands binding the legal documents. He held his phone with his teeth shining the light onto the crisp white pages as he frantically flipped through the comprehensive lawsuit. The bold black letters spelled out his absolute demise. It was not just a standard divorce petition. It was a massive, multi-tiered civil litigation filing detailing extreme financial abuse, malicious breach of fiduciary duty, and premeditated marital fraud. Carmen did not stay to watch him unravel completely. Her mission was flawlessly accomplished. She buttoned her winter coat, offered them one final pitying look, and turned her back on the men who had tormented her for years. She walked calmly out of the kitchen, her steady footsteps echoing down the grand hallway and out the front door, leaving them entirely alone in the freezing dark ruins of their stolen empire. Derek dropped the heavy legal files onto the granite counter, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. He swiped frantically at his screen, attempting to log into his investment accounts, desperately hoping to find a hidden reserve of cash to fix this catastrophic nightmare. But every single application he opened displayed the exact same terrifying error message. Access denied. His passwords had been revoked, his security questions had been altered, and his entire digital financial existence had been permanently erased. The crushing reality of his absolute financial ruin must have kept Derek awake all night, because by 9 the next morning, he launched his final desperate offensive. He did not come alone. He brought Chelsea and Jamal as his arrogant reinforcements. They completely bypassed standard visitor protocols at my corporate auditing firm, attempting to storm the executive floor through sheer aggressive entitlement. They thought they could corner me in my workplace, utilizing classic psychological manipulation to force me into dropping the foreclosure and withdrawing the massive lawsuit. They expected to find me shrinking behind a cubicle, desperate to avoid public scenes. They were met instead by a solid wall of corporate security. I stood calmly in the center of the glass-walled executive lobby, flanked on my right by Lawyer Maxwell, and on my left by the head of building security. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the three of them looking haggard and unhinged. Derek's face was pale and drawn, his winter coat wrinkled from sleeping in a freezing empty house. Chelsea was practically vibrating with rage, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. Jamal stepped out first, puffing out his chest and attempting to use his physical presence to dominate the room, just as he had done at countless family dinners. Derek immediately launched into a frantic, manipulative tirade. He tried to lower his voice to a deceptive register, begging me to call off the lawyers and come home so we could talk like rational adults. He claimed the foreclosure was a massive misunderstanding, and he could explain the mortgage discrepancies if I gave him 5 minutes of privacy. Chelsea chimed in, her tone dripping with toxic condescension, demanding, "I stop this hysterical performance before I permanently embarrass the entire family." She actually dared to suggest I owed them an apology for locking them out of their property in the dead of winter. I did not flinch, and I did not break eye contact. I stood there projecting the cold authority of a senior corporate auditor who had already won the war. Maxwell stepped slightly forward, holding a thick leather binder containing undeniable proof of their federal crimes. He informed Derek in a sharp voice that any further attempts to contact me directly would be considered severe harassment and immediately reported to federal authorities, currently preparing his indictment. The word federal struck Derek like a physical blow, silencing his manipulative rambling instantly. But Jamal was too arrogant to recognize a losing battle. He shoved past Derek, invading my personal space with a sneer of pure contempt. He pointed a heavy finger at my face, loudly declaring I was nothing but a boring, bitter accountant throwing a jealous tantrum because I could not handle his massive entrepreneurial success. He boasted his consulting startup was generating millions, and my petty legal threats would be crushed by his superior corporate lawyers. He tried to intimidate me, physically looming over me and demanding I withdraw the collection notice. Notice I supposedly slapped on his legitimate business. His aggressive posture did not intimidate me. It simply gave me the perfect opening to deliver the final devastating blow. I reached out and took the heavy binder from Maxwell. I looked Jamal dead in the eyes, watching his arrogant smirk falter as I raised the binder. I did not yell or raise my voice. I spoke with the icy precision of a forensic accountant presenting a terminal audit. I told Jamal his visionary consulting startup was nothing but a hollow shell company registered to launder the hundreds of thousands of dollars my husband stole from my corporate bonuses. Jamal opened his mouth to deny it, but I slammed the binder down onto the glass reception desk. The sharp crack echoed loudly across the quiet lobby. I did not stop there. I flipped the binder open directly to the final section of my financial investigation. I looked past Jamal and directed my gaze entirely at Chelsea. I told her I audited the exact destination of every single stolen dollar routed through her husband's fake company. I explained the money did not go toward payroll or vendor contracts or brilliant investments. I pulled out glossy, high-resolution photographs and pristine bank transfer receipts, laying them out across the glass surface, like a deck of lethal playing cards. The documentation was irrefutable. I pointed to itemized receipts from exclusive jewelry boutiques, showing purchases of diamond tennis bracelets and emerald necklaces. I pointed to property deeds for 2 luxury condominiums located in a very expensive neighborhood across town. I looked Chelsea in the eyes and delivered the absolute truth. Jamal had not bought those diamonds for his wife. He had not purchased those condominiums for their marital portfolio. Jamal used Derek's stolen money to buy expensive real estate and lavish jewelry for two different secret mistresses. He had been living a complete double life, actively betraying Chelsea with the exact funds her brother stole from me. The silence that slammed into the executive lobby was absolute and suffocating. The arrogant facade. Jamal had spent years constructing shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a fraction of a second. He stared at the photographs of his mistresses wearing stolen diamonds, his jaw hanging open in complete terrified disbelief. He had assumed his financial laundering was sophisticated enough to hide his infidelity from his wife and his brother-in-law. Chelsea stared at the glossy photographs, her perfect posture crumbling as the catastrophic reality of her husband, absolute betrayal, registered in her brain. She looked at dates on the condominium deeds, recognizing them as the exact times Jamal claimed to be away on crucial international business trips for his fake startup. Derek looked completely shell-shocked, realizing the money he risked federal prison to steal for his family had been secretly funneled to his brother-in-law hidden lovers. The perfect united front they had maintained for years disintegrated right there in my corporate lobby. The trap had been executed flawlessly. The pristine silence of the executive lobby shattered into a million jagged pieces. For a fleeting second, nobody moved. Then a guttural, agonizing scream ripped through the air. It did not come from me. It came from Chelsea, the untouchable golden child of the family, the woman who had spent her entire adult life radiating toxic superiority, completely unraveled right before my eyes. She lunged forward with explosive violence, her perfectly manicured hands curling into claws as she launched herself directly at her husband. Her designer handbag crashed to the polished floor, spilling expensive cosmetics across the marble tiles. She grabbed the collar of the bespoke cashmere sweater, shaking him with a frantic, animalistic fury. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know who the women in the photographs were. She screamed about the countless nights he claimed to be working late to build their financial empire. She struck his chest repeatedly, her sharp blows echoing loudly against the glass walls of the corporate atrium. Jamal stumbled backward, completely losing his footing in a desperate attempt to evade her physical onslaught. He raised his arms in a pathetic defensive posture, stammering out frantic, incoherent denials. He tried to claim the property deeds were falsified documents and that the jewelry receipts were corporate gifts for prominent clients. But the sheer volume of undeniable evidence I had scattered across the reception desk completely suffocated his desperate lies. The glossy photographs of his mistresses wearing diamonds bought with my stolen money stared back at him, stripping away every single layer of his arrogant facade. He looked small, terrified, and utterly pathetic. He begged Chelsea to calm down, pleading with her to lower her voice before the entire building witnessed their absolute humiliation. Chelsea did not lower her voice. She escalated her rage, her shrill accusations drawing the attention of every single employee on the floor. Office doors cracked open, and curious executives stepped into the hallways to witness the spectacular implosion of my fraudulent family members. Derek remained frozen in the center of the chaotic scene, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He watched his sister violently tear into the man he had risked federal prison to enrich. The massive scope of his own catastrophic failure finally crashed down upon him. He had stolen my savings, forged my signature, and defrauded a national bank only to discover that his grand sacrifice had secretly funded the rampant infidelity of Jamal. The supreme arrogance that had fueled his vicious actions completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling man who finally understood that his life was entirely over. He reached out a trembling hand, attempting to pull his sister away from her cheating husband. Chelsea violently shoved his hand away, turning her blinding rage toward her own brother. She screamed that Derek was a colossal failure, a pathetic manager who could not even steal money correctly without getting caught. The legendary family loyalty they had always weaponized against me dissolved into a toxic, humiliating public brawl. Lawyer Maxwell stood stoically at my side, watching the total destruction with cold professional satisfaction. He checked his watch and nodded slightly. The timing was absolutely flawless. The heavy glass doors of the executive lobby slid open with a sudden commanding force. A team of stern men and women in dark windbreakers poured into the reception area. The bold yellow letters spelling FBI across their jackets commanded instant terrifying authority. They were flanked by several uniformed local police officers, their hands resting securely on their utility belts. The chaotic screaming match abruptly died, replaced by a suffocating heavy silence. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with sharp, predatory precision. He bypassed the weeping Chelsea and walked directly toward my trembling husband. The agent loudly announced the full legal name of Derek, his deep voice carrying across the entire lobby. He informed Derek that he was being officially placed under federal arrest for massive bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and malicious wire fraud. Two local officers immediately grabbed his arms, twisting them securely behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly through the silent room. Derek did not resist. He simply stared blankly at the floor, his face drained of all color, finally realizing that his arrogant delusion had cost him his absolute freedom. The lead agent then pivoted smoothly toward Jamal. He recited a separate, equally devastating list of federal charges, citing massive commercial fraud conspiracy and international money laundering. Jamal attempted to protest, his arrogant voice cracking with pure terror as he demanded to call his corporate lawyers. The federal agents ignored his pathetic demands entirely. They forcefully spun him around and locked a second pair of steel handcuffs around his wrists, completely ignoring his loud, panicked complaints about his expensive watch scratching against the metal. Chelsea stood entirely alone in the center of the wreckage, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her husband and her brother get treated like common criminals. At that exact moment, the lobby elevators chimed loudly. The metal doors parted, revealing the parents of Chelsea and Derek. They had evidently rushed to the office building after Derek frantically called them earlier that morning for emergency legal support. They stepped out of the elevator, their faces immediately contorting into expressions of pure, unadulterated horror. They had spent decades raising their children to believe they were inherently superior, untouchable elites who could operate entirely above the law. They had turned a blind eye to the manipulative behavior of Derek and actively encouraged the insatiable greed of Chelsea. Now they stood utterly paralyzed, forced to watch their precious golden children face the brutal, inescapable consequences of their own actions. The mother let out a shrill, agonizing wail, desperately reaching out toward her handcuffed son. The police officers firmly blocked her path. The father stared at me begging, but I simply offered absolute silence. The agonizing wail of my former mother-in-law faded behind the heavy glass doors as the federal agents escorted her golden children out of the corporate atrium. The aftermath of that spectacular lobby confrontation was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. The federal justice system does not care about suburban social status or expensive designer suits. Derek now faced an airtight prosecution. Confronted with the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence I had meticulously compiled, his high-priced defense attorneys immediately advised him to accept a comprehensive plea deal. He stood before a federal judge in a dreary downtown courtroom, completely stripped of his arrogant swagger, and pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and severe bank fraud. The judge sentenced him to 84 months in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His prestigious investment management career was permanently obliterated. The state financial board permanently revoked his licensing, ensuring he would never legally touch another investment portfolio for the rest of his natural life. He was utterly destroyed. Jamal faced an even harsher reality. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation systematically dismantled his hollow consulting startup, exposing a massive web of commercial money laundering and tax evasion. His illicitly purchased luxury vehicles were promptly seized by federal marshals, and the offshore accounts he used to hide stolen funds were completely frozen. I was hit with a staggering array of felony charges that guaranteed he would spend the next decade behind bars. His carefully constructed illusion of immense entrepreneurial success shattered into tiny, irreparable pieces, leaving him completely humiliated and entirely powerless inside a cold, concrete federal holding cell without any remaining allies. His wealthy, powerful social connections instantly blocked his desperate phone calls, absolutely refusing to provide any expensive legal assistance. His mistresses abandoned him immediately when the stolen diamond jewelry was aggressively confiscated by government authorities as key criminal evidence. The most poetic justice, however, belonged entirely to Chelsea. The undisputed golden child who had spent her entire adult life radiating toxic superiority and looking down on working professionals was suddenly left with absolutely nothing. The federal asset forfeiture protocols seized the Lake Forest mansion, the luxury condominiums Jamal had purchased for his secret mistresses, and every single piece of jewelry bought with stolen capital. Chelsea was completely bankrupted. Her affluent social circle, desperate to avoid any association with a highly publicized federal fraud scandal, abandoned her instantly. She was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment in a dangerous neighborhood she once openly mocked at our family dinners. To survive and pay off her mounting legal debts, she had to take a grueling minimum wage job folding clothes at a heavily discounted retail store. There were no more luxury ski trips to Aspen, no more crystal flutes of imported champagne, and no more arrogant social media posts mocking my relentless work ethic. She was finally forced to live the miserable, exhausted reality she had always believed was entirely beneath her. My own path diverged completely from their absolute ruin. The divorce proceedings were swift and entirely one-sided. With Derek incarcerated and legally branded a convicted fraudster lawyer, Maxwell secured a catastrophic financial victory on my behalf. The family court judge awarded me total financial restitution, ordering the immediate liquidation of any remaining legal assets Derek possessed to repay the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had siphoned from my corporate bonuses over the years. I reclaimed every single stolen dollar, fortified my retirement accounts, and legally severed my name from his toxic existence forever. I no longer carried the heavy, suffocating burden of his deeply manipulative, treacherous family, dragging me down into their endless drama. The corporate leadership at my auditing firm was profoundly impressed by the surgical precision and tactical brilliance I demonstrated during the federal investigation. They realized I possessed a rare, ruthless capability for uncovering complex financial corruption. 3 months after Derek was sent to federal prison, the executive board called me into the primary boardroom. They did not just offer me a standard raise. They handed me a massive promotion, elevating me to the position of Senior Director of Internal Compliance. I was given my own dedicated team of forensic auditors, a substantial equity stake in the firm, and a beautiful corner office with an expansive view of the city. The grueling years of being treated like a disposable financial engine, the endless family dinners where my career was mocked, and the freezing nightmare of being abandoned at the airport all felt like a distant, fated lifetime ago. I had forged my own justice from the fires of their betrayal. I had taken the worst moment of my entire life and weaponized it to build an impenetrable fortress of personal and professional security. I poured a glass of crisp, cold, sparkling water and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse. The heavy oak doors of the apartment were securely locked, shutting out the noise of the bustling financial district below. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the towering skyscrapers of the Chicago skyline. The luxury apartment, my secret safe haven, was perfectly quiet and perfectly mine. There was no one here to demand hot dinners, no one to belittle my ambitions, and no one to drain my hard-earned resources. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my lungs expand easily and completely entirely healed from the pneumonia that had nearly killed me. I looked out over the glittering city lights, a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. I had not just survived the storm, I had conquered it. I was finally truly free and undeniably victorious. Have you ever had to absolutely destroy the toxic people who underestimated your ultimate strength? Share your story in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more tales of ultimate revenge and survival. The journey we just witnessed is a profound reminder that true strength isn't found in avoiding the storm, but in how you meticulously navigate through it once it hits. When the people you trust the most use your unwavering loyalty as a weapon, it can entirely shatter your sense of reality. However, this narrative teaches us that rock bottom can actually become the absolute strongest foundation for a brand new beginning. Instead of reacting with immediate chaotic anger, choosing to embrace cold, methodical clarity changes everything. It proves that our greatest assets aren't merely stored in our bank accounts. They reside deep within our intellect, our resilience, and our capacity to see the unvarnished truth once the comfortable illusion finally falls away. The betrayal was undoubtedly devastating, but it served as the ultimate catalyst for an unbreakable, fierce independence. We learned that family isn't simply defined by marriage licenses, shared holidays, or social status. True connection is defined by mutual respect, radical honesty, and showing up when it truly matters the most. Walking away from a highly toxic environment doesn't mean you have failed. It means you have finally chosen to value yourself over a beautifully decorated lie. True justice doesn't always require a dramatic shouting match. Sometimes the absolute most devastating response is pure, undeniable proof, and the courage to step forward into a brighter, completely self-made future. Have you ever had to discover your own hidden strength after someone completely underestimated your worth? Share your experiences in the comments below, and remember